Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Welcome back, horror hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. Today we are continuing our special that we started last week, 100 Years of Horror. So on last week's podcast, we went through the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, went through a general history of the horror genre through that time, and Mike and I each picked a highlight of that decade, a film that we've personally felt stood out. So this time we're doing the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And I will admit this was a much trickier thing to put together because there's a lot less discovery, just because I feel like from the 70s onward, these are the years that we have explored fully into the deepest. And like I was telling Michael earlier, I was like, look, all the 70s horror movies, unlike some things from the 20s or the 30s, I'm not just going to find some random obscure 70s horror movie and then say that's the highlight of the decade. That's not going to happen with that, or the 80s or the 90s. So this one is probably going to be a more familiar list. I'll try to change things up slightly. A couple of them, I'm not necessarily picking the best of the decade, but maybe one of the best that should be highlighted a little bit more.
Well, the genre seems to get more saturated with every decade.
Yeah.
I mean, even when there wasn't a lot of notable horror releases on any certain decade, there's still a lot of them. And it seems to multiply with every decade.
Yeah. So we're going to start with the 1970s. Am I correct, Michael?
Yes. Now, this is the decade that's extra special to me because I was born in this decade. So this is when I was first introduced to the world, and it's when I was first introduced to movies, and also when I was first introduced to the horror genre. Now, the 70s, this was the rise of Grindhouse. Horror became more ruthless. Slashers evolved and gained popularity. They didn't hit like they did in the 80s yet, but they were gaining popularity, especially by the end of the decade. And then the floodgates opened in general with horror. It opened up with both indie and studio films that dominated the genre.
My thing about the 1970s is this. I think it's one of the best decades in horror and movies in general. And I think that these are when, like you said, grindhouse movies, this is like kind of the introduction of like the real exploitation films. The 70s is when movies really got nasty and harsh.
Yeah.
And the reason is because prior to the 70s, there had always been a Hollywood production code. So there was only certain things that you could show on screen before. But by the late 60s, the code was lifted and was basically replaced with the MPAA. So basically the idea was now you can show whatever you want. It'll just have a rating and it'll just be restricted to the audience. So that kind of opened up the floodgates of more violent, graphic, rough, brutal films. It was also the era of Watergate. The Vietnam War just happened. I feel like that era in general, it was kind of an explosion of a lot of anger and raw violence in the 1970s. Hence, you get the grindhouse classics like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of the great horror films of the 1990s. It was really rough. The Last House on the Left is another one of the ones that's like that. Even The Exorcist, which is not an exploitation movie, that's more mainstream horror movie, is still very extreme and viscerally violent and raw in comparison to the supernatural or the satanic horror before, like Rosemary's Baby, which is a great film, but it does not have the same visceral quality as something like The Exorcist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's this era of this raw violence and anger in the air hanging over, especially in the United States. I think everybody was cynical and delusional from Nixon, from the Vietnam War, and they took it out in the most angry, violent, rough era of movies. I love the 1970s. It's actually my favorite era of movies, period. Even going beyond the horror, you can movies like Straw Dogs and Taxi Driver and A Clockwork Orange. That's when you started to see a lot more challenging content. Perfect for the horror genre. Floodgates were opening right at the perfect time.
And those nasty little films like I Spit on Your Grave and shit like
Yeah, I
that.
Spit on Your Grave.
And even higher profile horror films like Black Christmas was pretty mean and visceral.
Yeah.
So it also featured, you know, huge films like Jaws, Carrie, Alien, Zombie, The Brood, The Omen. The horror was huge in this decade. Suspiria, of course. Nosferatu, the remake of Nosferatu.
One of the best.
Yeah, Phantasm, Amityville Horror. So many great horror films in the 70s.
I'd say there's well over 50 classic horror movies to come out of the 1970s.
Oh, at least.
At least, at the very least. And you think about things like Don't Look Now, which is another. I know you don't like that one as much as I did, but that's another one classic from that era. Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah, this the rise of George Romero got even more popular with his zombie movies.
Yeah. So who should go first for their pick, their highlight of this decade?
You go ahead with yours, like last week. We'll go back and forth.
So my 70s highlight is going to be a very obvious one. All right, I wanted to pick Halloween, but I picked Halloween and I consider that to me Halloween is the perfect horror movie. And when we introduced our list of what we think are our 50 favorite horror movies, that ranked as number one. However, I've talked that movie to death, and we also talked about it recently on a Halloween special. So I'm going to pick another movie that I've talked to death, but not nearly as much. Carrie from 1976, nice. Brian De Palma. Like I said, if you know me, this is an obvious one. I love this movie. This is easily my favorite Stephen King adaptation. It has two of my favorite performances in the history of horror movies. Sissy Spacek as Carrie, and her mother, Piper Laurie, as Margaret White. They were both nominated for Oscars, and I think that they totally deserved it. Sissy Spacek is great in the role because she plays a bullied teenager, for those who know the classic story, who has telekinetic powers. She's a misfit in her school. She's an outcast. Her mother is a religious fanatic who inflicts a lot of mental abuse on her, hides a lot from her, so it's turned into a very awkward person that cannot really get along with her peers. She has a very endearing, sweet quality to her, and I think that's what makes a lot of the movie work, is that you feel a lot of sympathy and a lot of for her plight because of what she's been through. At the same time, because I think the horror is more intense because you understand the extent of how much this girl has been hurt, from when it gets to the prom scene where she's humiliated in a really awful way in front of the school. When her anger comes out, she becomes extremely frightening and a force to be reckoned with. And that prom sequence in Carrie is one of the great sequences in the history of horror movies. The way that it's just harsh red, the intensity of it. And what makes it so scary is that you have felt the immense pain that Carrie has gone through the entire film. So you know how intense the anger and the hatred is, even if it's misguided in certain places, even though the film shows that she's imagining people to be worse than they are, and even twisting some memories in her head for some people who cared about her. She twisted in her brain to believe, she couldn't understandably, that they were really out to harm her. So the entire sequence at the end where the prom burns to the ground is horrifying. I think it has some of the great, and this is a decade where there's a lot of great religious horror and horror imagery when you think about The Exorcist and you think about The Omen. But I really love the last scene of the movie when Carrie finally takes all the anger out on her mom after she tries to attack her, and she's posing in a very weird Christ-like pose with her long curly hair, and it's one of the most striking and bizarre images in 70s horror. And there's something about, and I know a lot of people get offended that it's blasphemous or whatever, that it's offensive, but there's something about religious imagery or religious iconography or religious stories that make horror a lot scarier. They seem to put this level of stakes into horror that otherwise might not be there, like the level of good and evil. And that to me is just one of the most striking images, and it's borderline blasphemous. Kind of looks almost like a grotesque version of what happened to Jesus Christ as he was crucified. And that's actually not even in the novel that Stephen King wrote in the book Carrie. What happened is Brian De Palma, being the very stylistic visual director that he is, he's very driven by visuals and trying to make like like visuals that are powerful. In the book, she just kind of has a heart attack and drops dead. Brian De Palma thought that was kind of visually boring. He said, it's a movie, we need to make something eye-catching, visually exciting, something that's going to stimulate the audience's imagination. So he came up with those wonderful last scene where Carrie uses her telekinetic power to bury her mother with a bunch of different kitchen knives and utensils in a Christ-like pose. And of course, it has one of the greatest jump scare endings of all time, that no matter how many times you see it, people always jump. My mom even told me a story that she went to go see Carrie at the movie theaters in 1976 when it came out. She said this guy in front of her, some macho guy, was eating his popcorn, and in the last scene, when the hand reached up, she said he threw his popcorn in the air, went flying, and started screaming, and everybody in the audience started yelling. So I can only imagine what it would have been like to have been there and seen it at the time. So yeah, Brian De Palma's masterpiece, Carrie.
And have you noticed how many horror movies since then have been inspired by Carrie and by Brian De Palma's style, particularly in Carrie?
Yes.
And it seems to be more and more with modern horror films. They seem to be really heavily influenced by Brian De Palma.
Well, what happened with Brian De Palma is that of his generation of filmmakers, he was friends with like Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, the Brat Pack, like that new Hollywood era. He was considered the disreputable one out of the group. He had less critical acclaim. He was considered a stylist. People always confused him with style over substance. And because he was more into genre filmmaking than his chums were, he was more willing to delve into straight up horror or slashers or do his own stylized version of giallo with something like Dress to Kill. So he was always a little bit more disreputable, and he had less critical respect. People always just thought of him as a director with great style but with nothing to say. What's happened is in recent years, as film appreciation has gone up, people have gone to see, unlike a lot of older critics, that style is something that's very important to cinema, the way that it is. And I think there's a newfound appreciation from De Palma from younger audiences who, some of the older audiences may thought he was style over substance. I feel like the younger people who are getting to it now actually get it. Like, yeah, it is style, and it's fucking wonderful style. And I don't even think it lacks substance. I actually say that the style goes hand in hand with the substance because it's very sensitive, emotional material that's kind of fueled by trauma and a certain kind of raw anger from a very marginalized person. Like, I sense that there's like a lot of emotions, and the style serves to emphasize the grand emotions of the film. So I think a lot of critics were getting too caught up in, oh my gosh, all he cares about is how beautiful it is. I'm like, dude, these visuals actually serve the emotion and the purpose of the story, and I think people are starting to get it now. More filmmakers. This is one of Quentin Tarantino's top 10 films.
Oh, cool. I love that stylistic flourish that he has, where he puts a character in the foreground and they're in focus, and then the character in the background is in focus as well.
Yes.
So you can see the reactions of both, and you can tell that can't be done in camera. So it's like it has to be done kind of a split screen thing.
It is, and there's like always like some kind of blurred visual, like in the middle. They kind of blur together, and it looks great. And of course, the use of split screen, the use of colors, like, and the colors are there to emphasize the emotion, because there's parts of the movie that are like beautiful when she's at the prom, where you actually feel Carrie's joy and her happiness for once. And it's filmed in this blue, glowing blue style, and blue is associated, especially light blue, is a soothing, psychologically. It induces kind of a soothing effect on the mind, and the camera floats in a very dreamlike style along to very beautiful music. And when it turns to the scary and the angry parts, the colors turn from like a really calming blue to an angry, harsh, glowing red that induces you with a sense of anxiety and panic. And like the slow motion of it all, the way that Brian De Palma draw that scene in real life when she's walking up and get it would happen very fast, but in the movie it's like time is slowing down and the suspense is drawn out as you're like getting to absorb every single aspect leading up to it. You get to like, it's even directed in an exaggerated style where when Carrie gets the blood on her and the bucket falls, the kind of sound goes down and it's like exaggerated in slow motion. You're not experiencing how it would look. You're experiencing it from I'd say Sissy Spacek, Carrie White's subjective experience of what it feels like to be in that moment, how time slows down for her.
And what's great about that moment is you feel her bliss. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost like her fantasies have all come true. But
Yeah,
you know as a viewer, what you don't know exactly what's coming the first time you see it, but you know something really bad is coming. So you're feeling her feeling along with her, but you're also feeling that feeling of dread.
I think that's what makes it so effective, because you feel how beautiful it feels, and you know that it's not going to end well, and you feel kind of pain because you don't know what it is, but you know something bad is going to happen that's going to crush this poor girl's dreams and fantasies. And I think that's why it's such a powerful horror movie. It's kind of relevant in the era of like school shootings. It's basically the same type of thing. Instead of a gun, it's telekinesis. It deals with issues like that. Yeah, Carrie, I really love this movie.
One of the best, finest Stephen King adaptations out there.
No question.
It's still hard to top that one.
Yep, it is.
So it's funny that you had an obvious choice, because I also made a very obvious choice.
I could already.
My choice is the biggest horror film of the 70s and one of the biggest horror films of all time, The Exorcist from 1973.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I chose this not just because it's the obvious choice for the 70s. It's the obvious choice for me as a horror fan, because this is what began my journey into horror. Like, I went to see The Hand at the theater with Michael Caine before I watched The Exorcist. So that was my introduction into horror. But this is what really grabbed me. I watched The Exorcist on TV, so it was edited down.
Yeah.
And I seen that it was an excellent horror movie. I seen that it was visceral, but I didn't feel it. When I was a kid, I was afraid of nothing. There was no movie that scared me as a kid. But what I love about The Exorcist is each year of my life, as I grew older and more mature, and had a different view of the world, a more mature adult view of the world, I became scared of The Exorcist like I never was when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it was 1999's The Blair Witch Project is what really opened the floodgates for me. And then I went back and watched The Exorcist after that, and I got all the undertones, all the fear that the audiences must have felt back then. So this is why I picked The Exorcist. It's directed, of course, by William Friedkin, written by William Peter Blatty, it's based on his novel, and it stars Linda Blair, Ellen Burstyn, Jason Miller, Max von Sydow, and Lee J. Cobb. It's about the mother of an innocent 12-year-old girl fights to save her daughter from a demon that has invaded her body. She enlists the help of Damien Karras, a priest in a crisis of faith, and an aging priest, Father Marin, who is familiar with the evil inside her and will stop at nothing to banish it. It was nominated for 10 Oscars, and it won for Best Writing and Best Sound. It should have won more, as far as I'm concerned. And it's one of the highest grossing films of all time when adjusted for inflation, and especially in the horror genre. Now, right from the opening sequence, you see Max von Sydow's performance. Between his performance, the carefully selected images, and this haunting, ominous score immediately gives the film a layer of dread, emotion, and the feeling that good is already at the mercy of evil. You just see that statue of Cthulhu kind of looming over everything, and the look on Max von Sydow's face, and just the reaction of the local people, and this sequence makes the climax that much more exciting and immersive.
May I interject something about that sequence?
Yeah.
What's interesting about Max von Sydow as an actor is, prior to this movie, what he was probably most known for was Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, and he plays somebody who is literally playing chess with death throughout the entire thing. And and in that movie, he's come back. He's like a knight that has come back from. I feel stupid for the religious battles that were going on back then. God, I sound such a dumbass right now. You know what I'm talking about, though. But he's basically a knight for for a religious army, and he's having self-doubt. So if in Ingmar Bergman movies, he always played that character who's somebody who's a very spiritual man who's always at war with something or with himself. So that's kind of like a character history that he brings to the screen. And it's also why I imagine William Friedkin, who is an Ingmar Bergman fan, cast him in this role. He seems like he was born to do battle with good and evil in a religious setting. That's what his history on screen consists of.
And another thing that fascinated me about Max von Sydow, I didn't find out until years later that he was not an old man in The Exorcist. He was about as young as the Damien Karras character, but he was aged with makeup. I could not believe it. So you still look at it to this day, it just looks like a frail old man.
Yeah, he died an old man a few years ago, but that was like way after The Exorcist when he actually became old. Like, yeah, he was not old when he made this movie. Believable as that role, though.
Yeah, definitely. So besides Max von Sydow, at the center of the film is the mother and daughter relationship, which seems genuine and sweet. And that's what makes the demon invasion that much more emotionally jarring when it happens. And also the struggle within Father Karras is riveting. It's every aspect of this movie that pulls you in could be a movie in itself. Like the struggle with Father Karras, that could be a movie in itself. Max von Sydow gives us a tragic savior that makes us feel that good will prevail and makes it more crushing when it doesn't. Because you feel this confidence in, Max von Sydow, Father, you feel this this strength about him, like he's gonna get us through this. But
he comes in like he was born to do this, like he knew he was born to do this, and he's the only one who could do this. And it's also the way he talks to Father Damien Karras, because Damien Karras is still in a state where he has doubts, and he starts going off on, he's manifesting different personalities and trying to give down the psychological profile, and he's like, no, there's only one. He has such confidence that, no, this is the devil, like, put these silly notions of psychology outside your mind now. We are here to do battle with good and evil, and beware. The good will mix truth with lies and lies with the truth. Like, he seems like he prepared. He spent his entire life like prepping to come to this one moment, and to have him just die is like, what? Like the entire it feels like if he can't defeat it, then what is going to defeat it?
And when the evil makes this man cower, you know that it's hopeless.
Yeah.
And even the smaller side stories like Lee J. Cobb's Lieutenant Kinderman, his persistent curiosity just brings both the comic relief and helps ground the story in the real world for me. It keeps bringing it back down to reality every time he starts asking his questions and being like almost passive aggressive, but it's hilarious at the same time.
It's weird because it's a very serious and almost raw, violent, visceral movie. Like, there's a grittiness to The Exorcist, and usually you would think comic relief would kind of be intrusive in a film like this, and it doesn't really feel like it breaks the style. It doesn't feel like out of place within the context of the film, his character.
Well, there's a layer of emotion in the way that he jokes with the characters.
Well, I also think that the movie is partially a movie that does believe in good and evil. There's a sense of good in the movie, and I think you have to show decent in order to sell this idea that there is good in this world and that can triumph over evil. You have to show examples of decent humanity, of good people, in order for that message to be effective.
Yeah, and as dominant as the horrific images are in this movie, a lot of the horror comes from the performances of the actors. Like the look of horror on Ellen Burstyn's face when her daughter is cursing and spitting green vomit, stabbing herself with a crucifix and shoving her mom's head into the blood. It just shows, the horror of the evil they are facing, and it shows the desperation of a parent who's helpless to save her child from that evil, and you feel every bit of it. And if it wasn't for the measured and really impressive performance by the really young Linda Blair, who was, the acting performance was beyond her years. And this dynamic wouldn't be nearly as effective, and the evil wouldn't feel nearly as dangerous or real if it wasn't for Linda Blair's performance.
Yeah, she's great.
And also what was very effective is the score. I found it surprising that William Friedkin actually rejected the original score by Lalo Schifrin. He reportedly threw it away in the studio parking lot. So this score, amazing as it is, it's surprisingly a cut and paste score taken from other works of composers like Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki and Austrian composer Anton Webern. The Tubular Bells that have become synonymous with The Exorcist was an existing song by progressive artist Mike Oldfield, and he reportedly doesn't even appreciate the way the song was used. I thought that was interesting. And that brings me to the cinematography, which is awesome in this. Owen Roizman. Owen Roizman did the cinematography on The French Connection, Network, Addams Family, among many classics. And it's both simple and impressive, and it's amazing shots that feel natural, but they don't call attention to themselves. Basically, what I'm saying is that it's excellent lighting, excellent shot compositions that are always effective, but it's never distracting as being, oh, this is a high work of cinema, even though it is. It never calls attention to itself. And then, of course, the special makeup effects by Dick Smith, who did the makeup effects on The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Deer Hunter, Altered States, Scanners, Death Becomes Her was a good one. And then the special effects assistant was Rick Baker. So the makeup effects were extremely real looking, even by today's standards, and especially for the time. A high level of detail and genuinely scary looking, even when you look at it to this day. The full-on, straight-on face of the Reagan demon still scares me to look at. But I thought some interesting facts about the movie. There was a huge fight between Jason Miller and William Friedkin. There was a famous story about William Friedkin would do outrageous things to his actors to elicit a response. So he fired a real gun next to his ear to get a reaction. So that ended up being a big fight between them.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And then, as we talked about on the Cursed Films podcast, Linda Blair injured her back pretty bad when she was being thrown up and down on the bed. And Ellen Burstyn had a permanent spinal injury when she was thrown to the floor. So when her butt bone hits that floor and she screams, that's a real scream. And then Father Dyer, played by William O'Malley, he was a real priest, and says that Friedkin smacked him just before the scene where he blesses Father Karras and his hands are shaking. That's why his hands are shaking, because he just got smacked by the director. I would not put up with that shit. But he's actually a teacher at a Jesuit high school, and he tells his students that The Exorcist is a pornographic horror film that he once did.
Interesting.
And also another one I thought was really cool, the voice of the demon, which that's another thing that's still scary to this day. The voice of the demon was actress Mercedes McCambridge, who was a accomplished actress herself. She was she won Best Supporting Actress for All the King's Men a few years before that. And Orson Welles called her the world's greatest living radio actress. So to achieve the demon voice, she chain smoked, swallowed raw eggs, and drank whiskey, even though she was sober with past alcohol problems. And William Friedkin actually had her forcibly tied to the chair for authenticity. And then she actually, after going through all that, she actually had to sue Warner Brothers for credit on the film. Because, to the producer's benefit, she did say that she did not want to be credited because she didn't want people to know that was a different voice that they put that on. She wanted the voice to feel mysterious to them. So she didn't want to be credited, but then after the movie came out and it blew up, then she wanted to be credited, of course. And it's also said that this ruined Linda Blair's chances of winning Best Actress for this movie, because it wasn't known at the time. It wasn't widely known that there was another actress did the voice. So it was made known.
People feel like it retroactively altered the way they view her performance. Like that's not necessarily all her. And yes, rightfully so. What little girl can actually make a voice like that?
Yeah. So it hadn't come out, but when she was nominated, so it had already come out by the time the award show aired. So a lot of people think that that's the reason why Linda Blair didn't win, is because it's not fair to give an actress kudos for another actress's performance.
Yeah, and a lot of the effectiveness comes from the other actress's vocals.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so scary. So yeah, that's one of the ones that it's an obvious pick, but it's a perfect choice. I think it works because it made the supernatural seem less supernatural. The way that it's directed in a style that seems very physical and tangible and like almost documentary, where a lot of even great supernatural films have a more fantastical feel to them. This doesn't have a fantastical feel. It has like a raw, physical, tangible reality. Like you just feel like you're watching something happen. It doesn't feel like you're watching spectacular events happen, even though you know you are. It just feels like an extension of the certain kind of realism that the movie's going for.
Yeah, and if you let the movie in, the kind of dread and fear that you feel when the demon shows itself is the same kind of fear and dread that you feel at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Like they start laying the foundation for fear right at the beginning of that film, and it never lets up all the way up to the end.
Yep.
And it's another one like The Shining, where I love it so much because I watched it several times throughout my growth as a human, and appreciated it in a different way each time I watched it.
Yep. Great movie.
So that brings us to when horror went insane in the 80s. Slashers, of course, blew up and became a full-on craze. The vampire and werewolf subgenres had some of their best entries. Stephen King films multiplied with The Shining, Silver Bullet, Pet Sematary, Christine. And even though slashers were huge, Supernatural was still huge with movies like The Poltergeist, The Shining, Hellraiser, The Beyond, The Fog. So this was an insane decade dominated by slashers.
I think this is also the decade that horror fans are the most nostalgic for.
Yeah.
There's also a certain type of horror fan, and you know them, that doesn't really never watches anything new, that only watches 80s horror movies. But then again, even though I think that that's a limiting way to look at things, 80s horror is big enough that it could be a genre that you could explore for years and still not get all of it. But yeah, it was definitely dominated by trashy, cheap, sleazy, poorly made slasher movies, and I love the majority of them. It's one of my favorite forms of trash. One of my favorite. I would use the word guilty pleasure, but I don't feel guilty about enjoying them. That's my favorite form of cinematic junk food is 80s slasher flicks. They always bring a smile on my face.
Look at that recent 80s documentary that's dedicated to 80s horror films. It's a 4-hour documentary, and then they just came out with part 2.
Because that one only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
It only scratched.
Now, that's an exploration. 8 hours of 80s horror.
So I'm going to do a little bit of a cheat with this one, and I'll talk quickly about each one because I'm going to do a tie. So for pure visceral horror in the 1980s, it's my background, The Evil Dead. Sam Raimi's 1981 supernatural horror film about a group of 5 college friends who vacation to an isolated cabin in a remote area. So this is the origin of all those cabin in the wood movies where that's kind of become a cliche at this point. Teenagers go to a cabin, have a good time, and something terrible happens. This to me is like the most visceral horror movie that I could think of. It is and there's a certain kind of energy that went into the making of this film because Sam Raimi was 21 years old when he made this with his friend Bruce Campbell, and you could tell that this is made by people who are young, eager, and starving and ready to prove themselves. It has the type of like relentless visceral energy that could only come from a thirsty filmmaker with a lot to prove. It is one of the most stylized horror movies of all time, and it is one of the ones that is the most brutal to watch. I don't know how to explain it, but it's graphic, it's violent, it's gory, it comes at you at a fast pace. It has the best sound effects I could think of, or the best sound design I could think of a horror movie. When you think of like this movie would be frightening if you closed your eyes and just listen to the voices, the demonic voices, how wicked they sound, the different effects that go on. You would feel like you could close your eyes and it sounds like the soundtrack to a nightmare or a hellscape just based on that alone. And what's weird is that since it's such a low budget movie, some of the effects are kind of cheesy and they're a little bit outdated, but there's such a visceral, committed, dedicated quality that it kind of bypasses its own cheesiness, that even though you recognize some of it's cheesy, it's so dedicated to what it's doing that it comes right back around to being disturbing and being kind of horrifying. So it's the only movie that I could think of where its cheesiness doesn't really feel cheesy because it all feels visceral and nasty and unreal. has like the way that Sam Raimi's camera just whips and zooms, those infamous long shots of the I guess the demonic force, the point of view chasing people through the woods, all of the effects. It has some of the most insane gore effects. The way that the way that it stretches out, the way that it emphasizes it, and like all the voices, everything about it is just pure visceral nightmare quality. One of my absolute favorite horror movies. But to give a nod to something a little bit more artistic from that era, I tied it with Possession, the 1981 film from Andrzej Zulawski, which is another form of a possession film, but this one is a little bit more artistic. It's a little bit more highbrow, equally disturbing in a completely different way. It's about a woman who fucks an octopus. And yes, I know it sounds really bizarre. She fucks an octopus, and it's about a dissolving marriage played between Sam Neill and Isabella Adjani. These are fantastic performances. It's one of the hardest horror movies to explain, but it has, even though it's much more cerebral and artsy than something like The Evil Dead, it has moments of equally disturbing quality. And I'm thinking of scenes like Isabella Adjani being underneath the, what is it? She's walking through a tunnel, and it seems like she's having an intense moment of possession where she's screaming and banging herself against the wall, and then she's like bleeding from her orifices. Pus is coming out from her orifices. It's such disturbing, horrifying imagery, and it's inexplicable, and it's very artsy, but every bit as disturbing as The Evil Dead. And even though The Evil Dead is, I guess, more emphasis on the disturbing, the visceral qualities, it is very artistic and artsy in its own way, though it's hard to see it because it whips by so fast. And it's just so in your face about it, you don't have time to think about it, whereas a movie like Possession lets you bask in those aspects of its filmmaking. So if you want to go pure visceral terror and horror in the 1980s, it's definitely The Evil Dead. If you want to go great art house but still disturbing, way out there original horror movie with great acting, then you got to go with Possession. So that is my twin pick for the 1980s.
Well, as campy as Evil Dead is, it still has an artistic quality to it because of that great filmmaking and how inventive it was.
And that's why I think I wanted to pair these together, is because they both do the same thing, but one gets recognized more for being something. Possession gets more recognized for being an art film than The Evil Dead is, even though The Evil Dead is every bit as artistic to me and it gets less recognized. The Evil Dead is more recognized as being visceral horror than Possession is. That's seen as a more cerebral film, but its visceral horror scenes are every bit as violent and disturbing and jarring as anything in The Evil Dead. So they kind of, like, to me, make a perfect contrast.
And plus, the Evil Dead is an excellent example of low budget filmmaking at its finest. And I read If Chins Could Kill. It's one of the biographies that Bruce Campbell wrote. There's some fascinating stories about what they went through, that making little camera rigs themselves out of 2x4s and shit, and just putting these big, thick, white contact lenses in the actors' eyes until they scratched their corneas. It was insane.
I could definitely see them doing something like that. The movie has, I don't know how to put it, it's just that relentless energy that never lets up.
Yeah. So before I say my pick, I'm just going to run through a quick list of just the type of horror that came out of the 80s. Besides The Evil Dead, we had Demons from Italy, Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, and I mentioned Poltergeist, The Shining, Lost Boys, The Thing, John Carpenter, Hellraiser, Reanimator, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, The Howling, Fright Night, Christine, The Beyond, Days of the Dead, Child's Play, The Blob. It's an insane. You see why there's 8 hours of documentary dedicated to this.
I heard at least 10 titles in there that all could contend, that all could arguably contend for the title of the greatest 80s horror movie. Like, I heard ones that I'm like, all of those are definitely competitors for that title.
The Fly, Opera.
The Fly.
It's an endless decade to explore. So what I went with was one of the major films that was part of the slasher craze. It's my personal favorite 80s slasher. It's Happy Birthday to Me from 1981. It's directed by the awesome director J. Lee Thompson. who directed Guns of Navarone, Cape Fear, and 10 to Midnight, among other Charles Bronson movies. It's written by John C.W. Saxton, who wrote Class of '84, with additional writing by John Beard, who wrote My Bloody Valentine. And it stars Melissa Sue Anderson from Little House on the Prairie. And this is one of the reasons why I love this movie so much, because I watched Little House on the Prairie a lot at the time. So just that the older sister from Little House on the Prairie being in a horror film, I was all in, and it did not disappoint. And it also stars Glenn Ford, who is from Superman. And the synopsis is: Virginia, played by Melissa Sue Anderson, returns to a private school after a serious accident and brain surgery and tries to resume her life as one of the top 10 in the school. This is complicated by her friends being murdered while she suffers a series of blackouts and memory loss. At this rate, there may not be anyone to attend her 18th birthday party. And this is another one, like all my favorite horror films, it sets the tone right from the opening scene. You get the opening sequence with a great kill sequence that features a brutal strangling and a razor blade throat slit. And we also see an air of mystery to it because we already see that the victim knows the killer. So it already gets your brain going. It gets your love for horror going and slashers. So it's really sets the tone. And then you meet all the kids. And yes, they're annoying, and they're no more annoying than any other private school kids, but mostly an interesting group of friends who have genuinely interesting conversations. Virginia is the smart, virginal one, so we root for her. And even when we think that she could be the killer, we still keep rooting for her. But the characters around her kind of start acting weird, and it throws you off. So even if it doesn't work, I love when this is done in a movie, when the director tries to throw you off and make you think, okay, this is obvious that this one's the killer, but it could be this other one. So even if it's not effective, I love when it's attempted. And then throughout the course of the killings, we slowly see the past unfold of the main character. And it's carefully placed flashbacks that are never overkill. Mm-hmm. And then as we go through the flashbacks, we see the doctor, played by Ford, who tries to help her. And then we get into the awesome kills. This is some of the best kills, I think, of the 80s slashers. The scarf into the motorcycle wheel, classic. The weightlifting kill where they drops the weights on the nuts and smashes the guy's neck, awesome. And then the supposedly accidental stabbing of the dork coming towards her with the flowers, awesome kill. And of course, the famous shish kebab kill that's on the cover of the album, on the cover of the movie. And it's and also that's when everything starts being revealed, is after that kill. So it's a big moment in the movie. And then the fire poker beating. So you get the killer beating the shit out of somebody with a fire poker, and then it keeps showing these shots of a POV from the fire poker coming down and hitting the guy. And then we come to the best part of the movie, the birthday party. It's gruesome, it's well designed, and it's well lit. What I like about it, it's not just well lit, it's kind of dark and brooding, and there's still some colors pop out of the darkness, but then the faces are lit by the candles on the birthday cake, so it gives this ominous glow to the faces, and you get this nice wide shot that's really cool, really well designed, and then you go in for the close-ups of each of the dead victims, and with the glow of the birthday candles, it's just awesome. And it feels just as twisted as it was meant to feel. And then that awesome moment when the girl's dad comes in, and he's got this look of shock and horror and disappointment on his face, and she just walks up to him and looks him in the face and smiles and puts a little birthday hat on him. It's just so twisted and gleefully crazy. So then right after that, you get one final twist, which I always thought was silly, and but it still adds to the fun and campiness of the film. But later I found out that that final twist was thought of on the set, because the studio thought that it ended too abruptly, too obvious, so they wanted to add another twist to the end. It seemed kind of tacked on, but it still, like I said, adds to the fun of it. And I love the makeup effects in this one. They were done by Thomas R. Berman, who also did this makeup effects on Frogs, Phantom of the Paradise, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, My Bloody Valentine, my first horror film, The Hand, Halloween 3, Body Double, The Goonies, and he's still doing makeup effects on Grey's Anatomy. This is one of the many 80s slashers that was centered on commemorative days because of the success of Halloween. So you had this one, Happy Birthday to Me. You had Friday the 13th, Prom Night, My Bloody Valentine, April Fool's Day, among others. And then some interesting facts about this one. The MPAA gave this one an X rating. So surprisingly, I was surprised to hear this. So some of my favorite kills, the motorcycle kill, the weightlifting kill, the brain surgery, and the fire poker kill all had to be cut down. So I'd love to see those uncut. And then Glenn Ford, the guy that played the doctor, he actually hit the assistant director, Charles Brave, because he called for lunch during one of his scenes. So the producer actually had to stop the police from arresting him. So that was another story of a really famous actor coming into a smaller horror production and just being a complete ass. So that was my pick. My Happy Birthday to Me.
I think that's easy to mix up with Bloody Birthday, although they're way different movies. I think that has probably one of the, only because of the title, because it's so weird to have the two slasher movies that revolve around a birthday theme come out so close to each other. But I think this one has one of the best climaxes of best and one of the most inventive climaxes in any slasher movie, and I think that's what separates them. Most of the climaxes, even when they're well done, and even in the best of them, they still kind of have a certain kind of formulaic quality to them. It's the final girl facing off against something. This one feels like something completely original or unique to the subgenre, a very unorthodox take, and a way to try to expand what the capabilities of the formula of a slasher film are.
And I love when the directors or writers find a way to bring all the victims of a killer together at the end of a movie. Because if you can find a way to do that, then each time you show one of those victims in their state of gore, then it immediately recalls that kill. So you're in the middle of a climax of the film, and then you get to recall every one of the kills. So it makes it a very effective climax.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So that was your pick for the 1980s?
Yes, and that brings us to the very strange 90s. Now in the 90s,
decade.
Huh?
It's what an odd decade of horror. I would say it's undeniably weaker than the 70s, and it's not as good of a decade for horror as the 70s and 80s are. Although there's some great stuff there, I don't think quite as good as the 80s or 70s.
So in the 90s, slashers were dying out, and then they were resurrected, for better or worse, by Scream. And then this was another decade with tons of sequels and reboots and very weird entries with some great indies. But the studios, once again, were trying to figure out how to navigate the horror landscape, and it seems like they didn't know what to do with it. But this decade scene, we did actually did a podcast on the 90s. If you guys 90s horror, if you want to go back and listen to that. But this one had movies like Blair Witch Project, Scream, In the Mouth of Madness, one of my favorite horror films of all time, Event Horizon, The Faculty, From Dusk Till Dawn, Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight, Candyman, The Sixth Sense, Child's Play 2, Interview with a Vampire, Cemetery Man, Misery, The People Under the Stairs, Dead Alive, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Night of the Demons 2, Exorcist 3, Castle Freak. Just tons of great entries in the 90s. Just a bunch of little weird ones.
So, one second.
So what's your choice for the 90s, Mr. James?
Okay, so here's my honest thing. I wanted to do something different because we already covered the 90s when we did our list. I would say that the top 3 horror movies of the 1990s, and none of these are my picks. I would say the 3 best horror movies, in my opinion, of the 90s are Scream, Audition, and Candyman. However, those are probably some of the most common, obvious ones, especially Scream, which I love Scream. But like you said, this decade was defined by a weird type of horror where, like, the slasher was revived. You said for better or worse. I would say worse, because even though I love Scream and I love the Scream movies, the slasher movies that came out of them, that postmodern, self-aware, meta, ironic shit that they were going for, just did not work with me. It has the quality of the worst CW television shows. That's what a lot of that stuff reminds me of. It's so 90s in the way that the teenagers are. It just like reminds me of like just what was like Beverly Hills 90210. It just reminds me of this certain thing in pop culture of like teenage 90s pop culture. There's something about that it kind of is a turn off to me that
Yeah.
I inherently, and the post Scream slashers are littered with this trash, and I hate that. But I love Scream. They never got Scream. They never got that balance right. So I'm going to go with one more cheat. Since this was an era defined by weird sequels, I am picking a tie for weird sequels. First one is two sequels to two. Actually, it's interesting. I'm picking two 90s entries for two series that are primarily known for being the ultimate 80s franchises. One is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is the seventh film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. It's the first time that Wes Craven was involved since the third one, and it's the first time he was actually behind the camera since the first one. I actually think this is the scariest take on Freddy Krueger. It's the most demonic and mean-spirited take on Freddy Krueger. It has a more realistic quality, and on the surface, it sounds like something that could be cheesy or could go wrong, but you could tell that Wes Craven, before Scream, was already going for the kind of self-aware slasher. So with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, it is basically about the people who starred in A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's about Heather Langenkamp. It's about Wes Craven. It's about John Saxon and about their lives. It's about them getting ready to shoot another Nightmare on Elm Street film. But Freddy ends up coming into the real world because in this version of the story, Freddy Krueger is not necessarily Freddy Krueger. He is a demonic entity that could only be contained by storytelling. So basically, in this world, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise was a way to contain the demon. So long as you keep telling the story, you can contain the demon. And since the franchise is over by the sixth one, Freddy's dead, the final nightmare. In this one, the demon is out of the genie's out of the bottle, as they would say. And of course, being part of the world it's been in, being stuck in that franchise, it starts going after the people who were involved in A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's going after Heather Langenkamp, invading her personal life, Nancy herself. Wes Craven plays himself in this movie. Robert Englund plays himself in this movie.
Yeah.
That is one missed opportunity, I will say. For the life of me, I don't know why they did not have a scene of Robert Englund meeting Freddy Krueger or being horrified. That is like, I really feel like as great as this is, I don't know why there wasn't. Do you agree with me? Do you see that should have been there? Like one scene. Oh well, regardless, I think it's one of the most inventive and unique entries in a slasher franchise. And it's so typical of the 90s to take something so 80s and try to make it weird or try to do it right for the 90s. My other one is Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, the other great 80s slasher franchise done with a very unique 90s entry. This one is done by Adam Marcus, who we had on the podcast about some episodes back. One of the best podcasts we've ever done. Please go back and listen to it, by the way. It's a wonderful interview. This is a unique entry and so typical of the 90s to me. Jason Goes to Hell is to take a franchise that is primarily known for being kind of one note and the same thing over and over again, which I love. I love all those movies. They're fun. They're a blast. I love great trash. But what makes this one unique is it breaks formula in a way that probably really pisses off. I know it pisses off a lot of fans, but in a way that I love, and takes a simplistic slasher like mythology that has never been altered very much as the series has gone on, and built an entire world behind it, connecting it to the Evil Dead mythology, connecting it to A Nightmare on Elm Street, giving it a base. Like it makes the Jason story seem a lot more large and epic than it's ever seemed in any of the movies before. And a lot of the origins and mythology that's filled out help to kind of clarify a lot of the nonsense of all of the the last ones, the inconsistencies, the fact that Jason is resurrected over and over in ways that don't make sense and are very inconsistent with what happens from film to film. I feel like Adam Marcus found a way to make it all work, smooth it out, added a bunch of mythology, pissed off some of the fans in the process, and gave us one of the best kill scenes in any Friday the 13th film. That tent scene where the girl gets the machete through her body, and
Yeah.
it happens right there. So I am going to pick those as the highlights because these two movies exemplify what the 90s were doing with horror. Let's try to take what was popular before, in this case Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, and let's try to give it a hip new 90s twist and make it something different or unique for this era. So
And
those are my
both
picks.
both great examples of how to revitalize the franchise.
Yes.
Even though I think Wes Craven's New Nightmare was a little more commercially successful, wasn't it?
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I don't think either of them were commercially successful, but they were both typical of the 90s to try to do something like that, take those old properties and make some unique entries into their franchises. And for me, they work really well. I could kind of see how Jason Goes to Hell would be divisive amongst Friday the 13th fans. I get it. You don't like the formula. That's what I love about it. I don't understand why New Nightmare is so divisive. I've heard so many people complain. I'm like, really? Of all the sequels, that's the one that bothers you? Like, but hey.
It's one of the best as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, one of the scariest, I would think.
And Jason Goes to Hell really deserves a second chance from some of the fans who hated it.
Yeah.
Because it's really imaginative, and I always loved it. I always thought maybe because no one else liked it around me, I thought maybe I was just biased because Ryan from Friday the 13th, the series, was in it. But then when we went and rewatched it again and I sat down and analyzed it, it holds up under analysis, and it's really fun on top of that. So
I think it's because I like it because I think it's a genuinely imaginative film. It's imaginative, and I think it's made by somebody who is obviously a fan of the Friday the 13th franchise, but is also a fan of horror in general and recognizes the flaws in the franchise and tries to fix them and rectify them. Basically what Wes Craven's New Nightmare is doing. He wanted to kind of erase the cheesy version of Freddy that had developed and that had come to full circle by the time Freddy's Dead had rolled around. So it was a way to kind of like try to rescue these franchises from themselves.
yeah, and I thought they were very good at doing that.
Yep.
So that brings us to my pick. This pick is probably the strangest out of all the picks that I've done over these decades. And this one is definitely an example of how strange the 90s were and how strange some of the sequels were. This one is Pet Sematary 2 from 1992. It's directed by Mary Lambert, who directed the first one, and written by Richard Oughton, and I believe this was his only script. And it stars, of course, Edward Furlong from Terminator 2 fame. Clancy Brown is really what made this movie special for me and what made it great. Clancy Brown is, of course, from Carnival. He was in Shawshank Redemption. He was the voice of Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob. He was the voice of Lex Luthor in the DC movies. And he was also on the show ER. And he's also going to be, I believe he's going to be the villain in the new Dexter. And I cannot wait for that. And the film also stars Anthony Edwards, who was also in ER, Top Gun, and Revenge of the Nerds. The synopsis is a teenage boy played by Edward Furlong and his veterinarian father, played by Edwards, moved to his mother's hometown after she dies in a horrible accident. Little do they know, this is the town where the Creed murders occurred, and no one seems to have learned to stay away from the pet cemetery. This one, it was panned by the critics. It was a failure at the box office. Everyone hated it, but I absolutely loved it, and I still love it to this day, and I'll explain why. This really nice gothic opening that sets the tone, and it feels like the first one, and then it's revealed that it's just a movie set. But it sets the tone of what to expect. Like it shows you one thing, but it ends up being another. Mm-hmm. The whole opening scene is very effective in showing what's in store, and it goes straight into an awesome and twisted funeral scene when Edward Furlong's mother gets killed. And the funeral scene is twisted and macabre. And then the music was great in this. It great atypical music as far as I'm concerned for a horror movie like this. It had the song "Revolt" by the Nymphs, which I still play on the regular to this day. "Shitless" by L7, love that song. "Poison Heart" by the Ramones. "Reverence" by Jesus and Mary Chain, and "I've Got Spies" by Dramarama, and even has an obscure Tracy Lords song. And I'm a big fan of Tracy Lords. She's the one that was she was in Crybaby, and she was a really controversial person because she was in underage. She was underage and in porn, posing as an 18-year-old. So, but personally, I like her music. So I was surprised to see an obscure Tracy Lords song on the soundtrack. Besides the music, it had a fucking amazing bully, played by Jared Rushton, who was the little kid in Big. How the little kid in Big became this awesome bully, I don't know, but he is very fun to watch. He's fun to hate, and it's fun to see him get what he deserves in the end. Also, I have to mention Zowie the dog is a great replacement for Church, because basically you have to have, in the sequel, you have to have another pet similar to Church, which is resurrected and sends the story into motion. And in this one, it was Zowie the dog. It's a beautiful Japanese Akita, and it had awesome attack sequences. You feel for the dog, you love the dog, you don't want him to get hurt, and then when he becomes evil, you fear the dog. And there's also a great dream sequence where the guy is having sex with his ex-wife, and then he looks up and her head is the head of the Zowie the dog. That was a really cool scene. And then we get into the kills and a lot of the small things that I liked about this. There's a great bully bike chase where all the bullies chase Edward Furlong into the pet cemetery. It was awesome. And then when they actually get to the pet cemetery, there's a shot that I love. It's facing the pet cemetery, and it kind of rises up like this. And as it rises up over this grave, this possum is sitting on top of a grave. I love that shot. And then the dramatic and volatile subplot with about Clancy being an abusive stepfather that becomes even more interesting when the cemetery comes into play. So you have this Edward Furlong has this friend that he makes, who is the owner of Zowie the dog. But I love how Clancy Brown plays the abusive stepfather of Edward Furlong's little friend, who's the owner of Zowie. Mm-hmm. And then it shows him being so abusive and so mean to the kid. And then when he's buried in the pet cemetery, you think, oh shit, this evil asshole is going to come out and be even more evil. But then when he gets out, he becomes kind of a goofball, and he bonds with the kid like never before. So I thought that was a really cool dynamic to add in there. And then I mentioned the dream sequences before. Now, admittedly, some of these dream sequences are really cheesy, and it could have killed it, but to me, it just adds to the campy strangeness of the whole thing. And you'll see what I mean as you get into the movie. And I love the great little trick-or-treating sequence that goes straight into the party at the pet cemetery. And then when you get to the party at the pet cemetery, all these bullies and all the kids of the town are partying at the pet cemetery. And then they turn the story of the first one about the Creeds into a little campfire story. So I like that part. And then one of the best scenes of the film is when Gus, played by Clancy Brown, he's having dinner, and Edward Furlong comes over to have dinner with them. And it's hilarious, strange, and still kind of creepy at the same time, where Clancy Brown is goofing off with the kids and kind of creeping out the wife. And he's kind of evil, but kind of funny and goofy. It's just a trip. And this one also has another head in the spokes of a motorcycle where it grabs somebody's scarf and sticks them in a spoke and it pulls their face into it. But this one might be even cooler than the Happy Birthday to Me one. And then it gets to this car chase kill, which is one of the most brutal and unnerving of the movie. Now, I hate to give so much away, but in telling what's special about these movies, I have to give certain plot points away. So what makes this car chase so brutal and unnerving is it's it's Gus, played by Clancy Brown, and he's chasing his wife and his son. And then he kind of laughs as he runs them in a potato truck. So they're like smashed into the potato truck. They probably died on impact. But if they didn't die, all the potatoes come in and crush them. And you know this kid, you know his struggle. And then to see kind of Clancy Brown kind of run them into this truck, and it's a gnarly crash. And just knowing that he's just laughing at their deaths, and it's the death of these characters that you care about, I thought was really effective. And then after the car chase kill, I have to admit, the movie really starts going off the rails. But even when it goes off the rails, it's still compelling to me because it becomes so odd. I mean, it's odd all the way through. It's strangeness from the beginning, but it grips you. It's a really good movie, a really surreal, really visceral, with good characters, a lot of cool little subtleties to it. And then when it starts going off the rails, it becomes even more odd, more surreal, more chaotic, but it's still somehow satisfying. And then it culminates in this moment where you see a dead woman. She's screaming and she's somehow melting, and you don't know why she's melting even. And she keeps screaming, "Dead is better, dead is better." And her voice gets more distorted. And I'll always remember this part because I think I told you this before. I went to see this movie and I sat down and the opening credits started, and this lady walked in, and she had a kid that was 5 and a kid that was 8. And I was like, I really hope this isn't that scary because this is going to freak out those kids. So they were doing fine through the whole movie. And then it gets to this part with this woman screaming, "Dad is better." And the kid grabs his hair. Ah, ah, ah. He just keeps screaming until she takes him out. So that really helped the effectiveness of this movie for me. And also another complaint about, I have to tell about my complaints about this movie. I told everything great about it. The babysitter character. She's a good actress and everything, and she even seems to bring something to the movie at first, and then she kind of disappears. She never seems to have a purpose and does a lot of weird things in the final scene just to help set up the climax, which is kind of lame, but it also adds to the strangeness that I talked about. And then it ends, and this is why I think people walked away thinking this was a bad movie. It ends with really cheesy guitar music after a strange and almost off-putting climax. So I think that may have helped ruin the impact for many. But if you really go back and revisit this, I think you'll realize this is really one of the great gems of the 90s. And I think it might have been even better if Mary Lambert would have been able to go with her original concept. Mary Lambert's original concept centered around Ellie Creed, who comes back to town after surviving the first film. But Paramount was not confident about making the lead a teenage girl.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, and that's something that they explored more in the remake, where they made Ellie more of the possessed one. That was kind of the center of the.
Interesting, interesting considering that so many horror films, the heroines or the leads are teenage girls. That they would find that complaint in a horror movie. I'm like, isn't that common? But okay.
it seems like kind of a clueless thing to turn her down for.
Yeah.
But everyone, please go back and revisit Pet Sematary 2. I bet it's better than you remembered it was.
So now we get into another odd decade, the 2000s.
Yes, this one, yes, another odd decade. The 2000s were, a lot of trends were dying and gave rise to Rob Zombie, which is really divisive filmmaker, but James and I are huge fans. Mm-hmm. And popular horror films arose out of pretty much every subgenre without a discernible trend at all that the studios could bank on. But there was notable horror releases declined toward the end of the decade. So this was another decade especially toward the end, where studios were scrambling, trying to figure out what the next trend was, because there was no trend in this decade.
There was the torture porn.
Yeah.
That was a trend, and they'd say in the early 2000s they had that trend where it was Japanese horror redone as American horror, and which is already kind of pointless when you I mean, even though there's some good movies, I like The Ring a lot, but it's a weird trend to have. It's just take movies that are pre-existing in another culture and just trying to adopt them or Americanize them and kind of neuter the aspects that make those Asian horror films so special, the things that are so unique to their culture because the flavor of horror, the imagery they bring, and then torture porn, which to me is bottom feeder stuff
Yeah.
within the horror genre. Because my problem with torture porn is uh, slasher movies already showed this type of style kind of peeking its way in when you think of movies like The Prowler, which is a very sadistic slasher, or even aspects of Maniac have that. But the difference was there was a level in the 80s slashers or these movies that were kind of sadistic. There was a level of fun to them. There was a level of cheesiness to some of them. There's a self-awareness. There's a campiness. There's an inventiveness in the makeup, too, that makes it kind of exciting and inventive, but kind of removes it from reality. Torture porn, which is the big trend, I think, of the later 2000s of this decade, is a turnoff to me because it's mostly showing graphic ways that you could just mutilate people, and it's not creative and it's not scary, and it goes around to being something that I find almost kind of pointless. I think there's good stuff that has come out of it, and I'm not averse to that. Obviously, I'm a horror fan. I'm not averse to extreme content, but I don't really care for stuff that just wallows in depravity for the sake of wallowing depravity. And I think that's one of my biggest problems with this decade is its trends. I think the two biggest trends, I think, are tacky trends. Taking Japanese horror movies and trying to make them American, and making horror movies that center on nothing, where you're not even scared of these people anymore. You're not even rooting. You're not even laughing. You're just waiting to see in graphic ways, which people can be tortured or mutilated. And that really, to me, isn't my idea of a good time at the movies. So I like this even less. This is probably my least favorite decade of horror, even though there's some stuff that I really love in the 2000s. This is a decade that, especially coming with the decade, which we'll get to after, compared to the 2010s and what came after, this is one of for my taste, it's not that great of a decade, even though I love a lot of what's here.
I never even discuss torture porn as being a viable trend in horror, because first of all, not a whole lot of notable releases came out of that trend at all. It was kind of just regurgitating the same kind of thing over and over again. Not only that, but the thing that started the trend, Saw, is not torture porn at all. So it's kind of a non-trend as far as I'm concerned. It never got any merit, and it never deserved merit.
Maybe it didn't deserve merit, but it is a trend. I mean, if you look at the documentaries at the time, they all will go into the torture porn era. And even when they did Scream 4 in 2011, which obviously is the decade after, horror had changed, and one of the big things that they were satirizing instead of slasher films and stuff like that was torture porn, and the idea of discussing it. So maybe it was a meritless thing, but that shows you how, for me, that's kind of a barren thing where the most significant thing is almost a trend that was almost a non-trend that gets emphasized, even though there's not really that many notable releases. But that's what a lot of people remember, a lot of 2000s just. And I think there were some other torture porn movies, but all of them kind of got dropped by the wayside. People forgot about them, or they were forgettable. It was
the Saw franchise kind of dominated it, because they did the same thing as they did the same thing as the Paranormal Activity franchise, kept churning out annual entries. So that's another thing that kind of fed into that trend.
So what's your pick for the 2000s?
For the 80s, I chose my favorite slasher of the 80s. So for the 2000s, I chose my favorite slasher of all time. And that's Severance from 2006. Anybody that knows me knows that I will not shut up about how great Severance is. And I'm going to talk about it more today. So it was directed and co-written by Christopher Smith, one of my favorite horror directors, who also directed Triangle, excellent film, Creep, and Black Death. This is a film that got a perfect balance of action, horror, and comedy, and it has all three elements in spades. It was co-written by James Moran, who wrote Cockneys versus Zombies, and it stars Danny Dyer, who thinks is an awesome actor from the movie Doghouse, and also Laura Harris from The Faculty. And the synopsis is: employees from a British weapons company go on a team-building retreat in the mountains of Eastern Europe. After being stranded by their bus driver, they're hunted one by one by unknown assailants who want to murder them all in the most brutal way possible. And this is the one where this is another one. So most of my favorite horror films is the opening sequence sets the tone of the film, and this one's no different. It opens right in the middle of the climax, which involves characters that we won't see until much later in the film. It's this awesome upside down throat cut. So the guy gets caught in a trap. He's hanging upside down. The guy guts him like a pig, and then you see all the blood run into his face, and then the camera flips upside down, and then the title sequence Severance comes up. It tells you everything you need to know about what you can expect from this film. So in this first sequence, we already know there's going to be humor, there's going to be horror, there's going to be brutality and kinetic energy, and it keeps it through the entire film. Then that opening sequence goes straight into the bus trip that properly introduces us to every single wildly different character with humor, volatile office politics, and all this happens within minutes. You end up feeling, this is why this first trip right here is why you end up feeling every single death, because you know these people, you know who they are, you know their different mannerisms, and even the assholes have scenes where they're likable or redeem themselves. Mm-hmm. And then I want to get into the characters that really shined for me. Was Steve, played by Danny Dyer. He was the wisecracking Cockney who takes mushrooms. He acts weird. He takes nothing seriously, but he's also somehow seems to be one of the smartest people in the group, but no one takes him seriously. And then you got the Laura Harris, who plays Maggie, and we see that she is tough, smart, no nonsense, and she's got a cool demeanor about her. She is both serious and has a sense of humor with a quiet coolness. And she has tremendous chemistry with her and Danny Dyer. I don't know why they didn't make any more movies together, but I hope they do. This is another one with great dream sequences, funny and twisted dream sequences. And they also hint around that it might be an animal stalking them in the woods, so it kind of throws off your expectations. And then that leads to a phenomenal sequence where three of the characters tell their own version of what ends up being the backstory of the killers and why they're being hunted. The first character who tells the story, they tell it in a silent film sequence, very artistic, very creative. The next character tells their version of the story. It's the real story told in documentary fashion. And then Danny Dyer tells the third story, which is a campy and silly fantasy with all these voluptuous nurses surrounding him. So that's one of the best sequences of the movie. And then after this, I love how you get a horror film where, especially a horror film that's in the slasher genre, which usually relies on stupid characters. But with this one, the complications arise that only involve strange but not necessarily dangerous occurrences, and getting back home is the goal. So it makes sense that they split up. So then when they split up, this allows the brutality to be ramped up, the really brutal kills to start before the rest of the characters even know that there's any real danger. That's one of the things I love about it. And then out of this, we get a funny and exciting paintball scene. While we already got to see a couple of characters that we know well get brutally murdered, and then we're in the middle of a comedic paintball scene that still gets creepy at times, and we see some brutal kills of other characters while we're cutting back and forth between this one. This goes into the bear trap scene, which this guy gets his leg caught in a bear trap and he kind of freaks out and he tries to take off and he rips his leg off. So this was all done practical effects in camera. Mm-hmm. And the guy's body double was an amputee, so he had an amputated leg, which makes this that much more effective. And that goes right into a really comedic scene when Danny Dyer takes the guy's leg and he goes into the bus to put it in the fridge. And it's a shot from inside the fridge as he put in the leg in there. The leg and the foot and everything looks 100% real. So he's putting it in there and he can't fit it in there with the shoe. So he takes the shoe off. Mm-hmm. And he takes the sock off and the foot's right in his face. He's and he stuffs it in there. Great little sequence. And then that goes right into this. Two of the characters having a conversation about what happens when your head is cut off. Like, mm-hmm. The guy insists that you keep you keep thinking, your mind keeps going, and you see what's going on after your head is cut off, and that's followed
Safe
directly
for
by
the audience to see, though. Safe sense for the audience to see.
yeah. So it's a part brutal, part hilarious decapitation, and then we see the flamethrower, which is both brutal, and then it comes up in a hilarious fashion later on in the story. And then I love this part, another little small part where there's two of the characters sitting there discussing about whether they should leave another character behind. While they're discussing whether to leave him behind or not, the killer is behind them in the background dragging the guy off. So they finish deciding whether they're going to leave him or not, and they get up and the guy's gone. I love that part. And then the whole sequence of where Danny Dyer and Laura Harris, they're kind of fighting the killers together, and then they get separated, and then you see each of them fight the killers, and then they come back and come back together again to fight for the action-packed, exciting, and scary and funny, all that at the same time. And then the landmine sequence, where one of the characters steps on a landmine. It's funny, sad, and ironic that a weapons manufacturer suffers his fate by stepping on a landmine. So that was pretty cool. And then you get to the climax where the characters reach the real lodge they were supposed to be from the beginning. And then you meet the characters that you've seen at the beginning of the movie, and everything kind of comes around full circle. And another one of the funniest scenes is when the older salesman guy comes out. Oh, I'm going to save the day. Oh, these guys will come after you. I'm going to take care of them quick. So he pulls this brand new rocket launcher out of the thing. He pulls it up. He said, I'm going to take care of all these guys. And the rocket goes straight toward the killers and goes straight up in the air and blows the airplane out of the sky. So that's hilarious. And then the whole sequence of Laura Harris hanging upside down, because you get this feeling of danger and immediateness, because you've seen a character be caught in that trap at the beginning of it, so you immediately fear for her life. And just her scream and the visceral way she fights, it's exciting, and it also brings you closer to the story and get you on the edge of your seat and wanting to know what happens next. And then Danny Dyer fighting two of the killers and sticking a knife in their asshole. Another one, exciting, action-packed sequence that also is very funny. And then another thing that I love about Laura Harris's character, she must be a horror fan, because she does not make the mistake of leaving a killer alive. When she kills a killer, she goes back for the double tap, and it is brutal. So then the entire climax in the story was very effective. The characters enter this town that you've only heard in the little campfire story that they had earlier to show the backstory. And so the climax, just like the first scene, has everything that makes the story great. The comedy, the action, the horror, everything is packed into that climax. And hilarious fact that I found out about this movie is about the bus crash. There's a really good bus crash in this movie. So there was a Hungarian stunt team on this that were not nearly as concerned about safety as the American stunt teams were. So they planned it to the T. They were supposed to drive the bus somewhere around 25 miles an hour. But the stunt driver driving the bus wore nothing but a seatbelt and a helmet, and he got up to like 45 miles an hour when he hit the ramp, much faster, and made a gnarly crash. So it was much worse, a much more impressive crash than they had planned on. So they had to do some quick rewrites on the set, because the crash was so severe that the characters would be much more injured. So they had to do some rewrites right on the set to compensate for that. So I thought that was a really cool fact. But this is definitely a hidden gem, British horror film. I love the way British do horror, and I love the way they handle slashers. They always seem to be very self-aware and have an element of comedy to them. And this is one of my favorites of all time. Definitely a personal favorite. So check out Severance if you have not.
An interesting choice. I had a feeling it was one you might pick. I was hoping you would pick The Devil's Rejects. You gave me an excuse to talk about it. That's what I would pick as normally as my favorite horror film of the 2000s. To me, that's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the equivalent to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of that decade.
Yeah.
Perfect blend of hardcore, rough, throwback to exploitation, grindhouse horror, with a modern sensibility to it and a sense of humor, more of a sense of humor than a lot of those 70s movies had. However, we've talked to death about The Devil's Rejects on this podcast and said, hey,
Yeah.
so I'm going to highlight a foreign Swedish vampire film, which I'm sure you already know what it is, Let the Right One In from 2008. Directed by Thomas Alfredson. And one of the reasons I want to pick this one is I actually think this is one of the best horror movies to come out of the decade. But I also feel it's more of like a unique entry that kind of clues you in, since it comes towards the end of the decade, of what the next decade of horror has in store for you. I think it kind of clues you in that if this decade of horror seemed kind of wonky and inconsistent, Let the Right One In is the sign that the future of horror is very bright. And indeed, it was very bright. It is set in 1982 in Blackburg, Stockholm. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Oscar. He's a lonely, bullied kid who is an outsider. He dreams of taking revenge against a trio of bullies who are always making his life terrible. And he befriends Eli, his only friend. Eli is a little girl that he discovers in a snow-covered playground just outside his building. The only thing about Eli is that she is a vampire, and she has been that age for a very long time. This is a beautiful horror movie. It's not just like good because it's scary, which it is. It's brutal. The attacks are visceral, and it's a great take on vampire mythology. But I think what makes it work is it has a sweet kind of fairy tale quality to it in certain aspects in terms of the relationship between Oscar and Eli, the young vampire. There's something very sweet and endearing about the relationship between those two characters, and the way that Eli, you see several times, is actually a vicious monster, but she still manages to have a lot of emotion and care for this young boy, and it's a big selling point of this movie. I think it's beautiful to look at, the snowy setting, and I love the way that blood red looks against a white snow. It's always a striking image, so that's why I kind of like horror films that are that take place in the snow or in such harsh white or gray areas, because the blood always looks fantastic off of that background. I think that the vampire attacks are visceral. It has a fantastic ending sequence taking place in a pool. Absolutely magical.
Probably one of the best of the decade.
Yeah, one of the best of the decade. I feel like this is like such a unique entry. It's a horror film that I feel is kind of uncharacteristic of the horror that was dominant during this decade. I think The Devil's Rejects, which is I would normally pick as my number one, that's probably more representative of some of the best 2000 horror movies like that, or The Descent, or something like that. But this is like kind of an outlier, a different type of horror film, and I just think it's wonderful. I know some people I've seen complain that it's not scary enough or anything. I'm like, dude, it's as scary as it needs to be. The story is as compelling as it needs to be. There doesn't need to be minute-to-minute kill scenes and minute-to-minute terror in order for this to be effective as a horror film. So I never really understood those complaints. I kind of feel like the horror scenes are all that more effective. And I think Eli, she's a lot more horrifying when you do see her attack, because you spend so much time with her, spending time with the young boy Oscar, that she kind of comes across as a sweet, endearing person, the way that she looks after this boy, that it's kind of jarring when she goes on her brutal attacks, and the way that she uses the fact that she's a little girl and that vulnerability to lure people in. And you feel kind of bad for some of her victims because they think they just see a helpless little girl, and the way that she uses that against them. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Interview with the Vampire.
Oh, yeah.
Except she's a little more of a more mature age than Kirsten Dunst's character was in that film. So a lot of those reasons I pick Let the Right One In to be a highlight, because I think it was a horror movie that showed what the future of horror was going to be in the 2010s.
Yeah, and to me that remake, Let Me In, only served to show what was so special about that original. Because you see all these sequences that were done on a really low budget, very inventive, and you see them recreated with a big budget, and they just fall completely flat. That's how much imagination that original had.
Yeah. And it's just, I think it remains a unique horror film to this day. There's not many vampire films that are like this.
No, not at all. But it still has that gothic feel to it still.
A classic kind of feel to it. That
Yeah,
classic
exactly.
Gothic feel. Kind of like the old Universal horror movies had a romantic edge to them, where they had, I don't know how there was more to it than to a lot of the early classic Gothic horror than just horror. There was like a love story. There was like emotion. There was, I feel like those movies had different goals in mind than a lot of the 2000s horror did, which I think a lot of the 2000s horror was meant to be extreme and depraved and harsh and in your face, not necessarily nuanced and with sweet stories. And that works wonderfully too, because like I said, I love The Devil's Rejects. There's nothing remotely sentimental or sweet about it. It's great because it's vicious and cruel and relentless about it. But it's also nice to get this type of a throwback to that type. It's a throwback to the more gothic style and a signpost for the future where art house horror is going to be explode in the upcoming decade.
And I love that scene in Let the Right One In where the boy refuses to invite her in, and she kind of stands there and starts bleeding out of her eyes. That was really emotional and really intense as well.
Yep. Show how much she cared about him, that she's willing to suffer like that for him to prove a point.
Yeah. Such a cool movie. A lot of great stuff going on in that one.
Yep.
So that brings us to the final decade we're going to discuss for our 100 years of horror. Another strange one, and this one is arguably one of my favorite decades of horror. So in the 2010s, horror was finally becoming a force to be reckoned with, and studios realized you don't need a trend to make a successful horror film. James Wan started cultivating his horror master status. Many sequels and reboots were still being funded, but original indie horror, as well as mainstream horror, rose in popularity and became the most successful genre of them all by the end of the decade. We also saw the rise of divisive highbrow horror in this decade.
Art house horror.
Yeah, with the main divisive ones like The Witch, It Follows, Hereditary, Midsommar, still have people going at each other's throats to this day.
The Lighthouse.
Yeah.
Duke.
You got the Bone Tomahawk, American Mary, Get Out, The Quiet Place, The Devil's Candy, Don't Breathe, Creep, Doctor Sleep, Bliss, Tigers Are Not Afraid, The Endless, Call Out of Space, Raw. It's countless. The list goes on.
I think this is all right, so 2010s, I think in the 2000s alone, I think the 2010s is a better decade for horror than the 90s and the 2000s combined. And I think we saw it right away. Although it took a few years to be clear what exactly this was, I feel like in the early years of the decade, you could feel an excitement brewing in the horror genre. And I think a prime example of this would be The Cabin in the Woods. It felt like a modern day Scream. It came in the early part of the decade, though that style, don't get me wrong, is not what defined what 2010's horror was. It kind of brought something a little bit, like it kind of seemed like it was revitalizing it. You had James Wan coming out with The Conjuring, which seemed like a little bit of a throwback, fresh movie, which was really popular. And then I think these two movies, I would say, are the turning point, what kind of turned what we realized what the 2010s horror was going to be. It was The Babadook and It Follows being released around the same time. These are two horror movies that got, and at the time, now it seems like it's normal for horror films to receive great critical acclaim. These two horror movies that came out, had great critical acclaim. They were like festival award winners. They were films that critics praised to the high heavens, and they were movies that cinephiles who don't have a big fondness or respect for horror, loved these movies. And it was signaling like these were the next thing. William Friedkin came out talking about how The Babadook is the scariest thing he had seen in years. And I think this kind of buildup created a backlash for these two films that were like, had such great festival hype, well reviewed, critics and cinephiles seemed to love it. It seemed like something new. Lo and behold, they land, and horror fans are split, to say the least. while there is a large segment of the horror community like us who fucking loves these movies, who were so excited to see that horror explode like this, there is a large portion of the horror community that hates this decade because it is defined by divisive art house horror movies.
Yeah.
And I think it's the decade where the quality of horror and the sheer number of films exploded. There are so many great high quality horror films that came out, but it's a decade where a lot of the fan base of horror has remained pissy and pessimistic and angry at this new trend in highbrow horror. They want it to go back to the 1980s, their sleaze, exploitation, grindhouse, which I love. But I totally embrace this newfound critical respect that horror found in the 2010s with movies like Hereditary. And I really think that a good handful of the horror movies that came out in the 2010s are not just some of the best movies of that decade or the best horror movies of that decade. These are some of the greatest horror movies of all time. I think that Hereditary, The Witch, Get Out, Cabin in the Woods, from the way, like, some of these I think are great contenders for all timers, like within the entire history of horror. Like a handful of titles can contend for it, and then you have wonderful exploration. You said a film like Bliss or Loose, where horror films start to experiment with the filmmaking and what they could be and what they could do. I felt like the 2010s was just an explosion of creativity and style and new voices and new ways to tell horror stories, and new, like, an elevation of the genre to a point where it's somewhere completely different. I think this was a fucking fantastic decade for horror films. Great.
But keep in mind, while all that was going on with indie horror, there were all these big blockbuster horror films coming out, making it the most profitable genre of all of them.
Mm-hmm. And that's without even covering it in those studies. I mean, I did mention The Conjuring, but like, it seemed like an exciting decade that started with at least a couple of films that indicated something exciting was brewing. And then when those It Follows and The Babadook, it came out, it kind of clearly defined. But even before those two came out, there seemed to be an explosion at the beginning of the decade. These little creative horror movies coming out, the commercialization becoming larger, the imagination getting bigger and better. So I
think it's going to keep. I think it's going to keep that pattern and keep growing into the next decade.
I hope so.
Because more and more talented filmmakers are getting into the horror genre and being inspired by all these highbrow horror films, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then studios are seeing that it's a viable genre, and they're like, Netflix came out saying, we want to invest a bunch more money into horror. Of course you do.
Of course. Think about the voices: Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, Jordan Peele. These are like defining new. Jennifer Kent, she's another one. These are like new voices, like, that are like, I don't know how to put it, but these are exceptionally talented filmmakers. I think this is some of the most talented batch of horror filmmakers that we've ever had that are coming, and I can only imagine what a lot of their careers are going to produce in the future. Like the unique voices, there's more diverse voices. We have more people of color telling their stories. Of course, with Jordan Peele is a big help. Get Out was a great turning point for the horror genre. You see a lot more queer horror kind of rear its head in. I feel like it also was defined by a diversity of voices, more women filmmakers, more black filmmakers, just, expanding whose story we can tell and whose stories we can tell. I just think complete explosion of so many things that make this a great decade in horror.
More inclusion definitely helps send horror in the stratosphere.
Yeah,
and that's also what's going to keep horror being more successful in the future decades.
Yeah, I think so, because now people see horror as representing every walk of life. Now I feel like it's inclusive in a way that different types of people from different backgrounds and different lifestyles can find horror films that are catered to their experiences, to what they've been through. And I think that even though the 70s and 80s are incredible for horror films, not all of those movies are relatable to every audience member. It's mostly the same types of stories, and I don't criticize this because I think they're great films, but I think there's a wider degree of relatability in terms of diversifying voices in the 2010s, where I feel like everybody is included in the horror genre now. And it's not just people who love it, but are not represented, no longer outsiders looking in. It's like it's completely penetrated into horror culture now.
Yeah.
So yeah, the 2010s, one of the very best decades of horror.
Yeah, there's any number of films I could have picked that represented how great this decade was. But I chose one that's a little obvious. You mentioned, you touched on it a little bit already. It's The Cabin in the Woods from 2011.
Okay.
Another one like Severance, that it's a healthy mix of subgenres, and it's also very self-aware, and it's also the slacker turned hero, just like Severance. But this one took the mixtures of genres into another stratosphere. This one's directed by Drew Goddard, who wrote Cloverfield, Lost, World War Z, and The Martian, and this was his directorial debut. And it was written by him and Joss Whedon, who did The Avengers and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And it stars Chris Hemsworth, who went on to play Thor, Kristen Connolly, Fran Kranz, Richard Jenkins from Bone Tomahawk, and Bradley Whitford from Get Out. It's a familiar horror story turned on its head. 5 friends go to a remote cabin in the woods and are stalked by killers. But we soon find out that they're being manipulated by a group of scientists who deliberately put people in horror situations to appease the gods. So this one had an attractive, charismatic cast mixed with seasoned character actors who provide the behind-the-scenes originality. And the characters, the main young cast, they do not fit their stereotype. Their characters do not. But I love how they're manipulated into being those stereotypes. That's what really stands out about this one. And I love how as the film goes along, it hints at the fact that it's staged. And it's almost too cliched with the ominous warning old man, the virgin, the stoner, the jock, the slut. But everything is done with, to perfection. Like, yeah, it was a cliched ominous warning old man, but it was a badass ominous warning old man, and it was a cliched virgin, but she was a really good character, really good actress. And then you see the scientists start taking bets on which monsters will attack. And there's a hilarious side story about Bradley Whitford's character being obsessed with the merman. And then it culminates in this twisted, hilarious moment among many in this film. And then I love the glimpses of some of their international operations and monsters. And then all these international operations start failing. So they think, the American operation is the only one that's going to save the world. So in order to save the world, they have to kill off all these teenagers. So then you get into these awesome scenes. Like, I love scenes when a good-looking jock type of guy comes in and he's going to save the day. He's got this rousing speech. He's going to get everybody into it. And then it goes into the motorcycle jump. And he jumps. He's going to save the day. And all of a sudden, it's completely wiped out. It's another one that plays around with your expectations. And then it gets to the scene where they release all the monsters. And wow, so impressive. And it's a $30 million budget, which seems like a high budget to us, but by Hollywood standards, that's a pretty low budget, especially the fact that almost all these monsters were done practically. And the death toll in this movie were 69. There's 69 deaths in this movie, but if you think about it, the death toll is actually 6,873,741,054. So that's a damn big kill count. And if you've seen the movie, you know why the kill count's that high. So, and then you see another great touch to this movie. You get the director, played by Sigourney Weaver, and she explains the plot to the survivors, and then you get what they're going for with this movie. You get why this is such a critique. It celebrates horror, and it's also a critique of some of the cliches that are steeped in horror. Like the director is Sigourney Weaver, so she represents Drew Goddard, or a horror director. And then the writers are represented by Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford. So they represent the writers of these horror films that force these characters into these cliched situations. So this is why Joss Whedon said that it was a loving hate letter to the horror genre. So it showcases everything he loves about the genre while critiquing everything that they hated, the cliches, the stereotypes, and especially torture porn. This was their big criticism about torture porn and how useless it is. And the practical makeup effects and creature design were done by Heather Langenkamp, Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street, and her husband, David Leroy Anderson. There was nearly 1,000 people were transformed into around 60 different character types. And they had to recruit about 60 people to take care of this. So they rented a big warehouse and just cranked out these characters. And by the way, it's interesting to note that I think it's 3 or 4 characters in all the squares of monsters. 3 or 4 of them were Left 4 Dead characters, the video game, because this was supposed to coincide with the release of a Left 4 Dead video game, and you were supposed to get an extension where in the video game you fought through the cabin in the woods and you fought through all the monsters to get to the next level. But that was kind of squashed because of I think it was some studios started going under, and there was some like movie releases pushed back, and they didn't even know if Cabin in the Woods was even going to be released or not. But then Lionsgate, it was interesting that Lionsgate picked it up, and by that time, Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard didn't think they even had a good movie anymore. They're like, it's kind of done, it kind of fell flat, and nobody's interested in releasing it, so maybe it's not a good movie. So then Lionsgate came along, and they actually had a meeting with them where they sat down and said, explain to them what was great about the movie, and kind of they fell in love with their own movie again, just by the prompts of Lionsgate Films.
Another reason that they decided they took interest was, this is usually the case, this is something that's common in Hollywood. If certain people are involved in a project and the Hollywood shelves it, but a couple of people involved go on to other projects that blow up, then they wanted to push it out. For that one, it was Joss Whedon who had just did the Avengers.
Yeah.
And worked on the script. And then, of course, Chris Hemsworth, who is in the Avengers as Thor, that had just blown up, and he wasn't even that big of a thing before. I think Thor is what made Chris Hemsworth a star. He was kind of like, it was a gamble for the studios to even cast him in a role like that. And one of the reasons that pushed them was because the commercial success of the Avengers and Chris Hemsworth becoming a thing with a connection of Joss Whedon also gave them some kind of confidence that there's an audience. That happens a lot in Hollywood, where they shelve things and then bring them out later.
Well, he was hired for Cabin in the Woods even before he was hired for Thor or Red Dawn.
No, I know. That's what I'm saying.
And then it was delayed. But it was actually the dailies from Cabin in the Woods is what got him the part in Red Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
And then the part in Red Dawn and Cabin in the Woods what got him the part of Thor. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. But in turn, they released it because they saw that these people had some form of success to them. So technically, it would have been a 2000s horror movie, not a 2010s. But I think it's kind of appropriate that it was released at the beginning of the decade, because it's kind of like showing the level of excitement and the creativity that was brewing, that was just on the horizon. It's like a good type of horror film to ring in. I mean, it's 2011. It's not right at the beginning of the decade, but it's early on enough in the decade that it indicates a certain type of excitement brewing around the genre.
Yeah, and just like Severance, my favorite character in this was the stoner, the slacker, and I love that dynamic when you take a cliched character like that and make him the hero and give him characteristics that are compelling and not just the cliched stoner, you know.
Right.
But
so you know how Chris Hemsworth is the jock character in that movie?
Yeah.
And they kind of have to maintain that image. In order to maintain that and keep that, the stoner character, they actually put him in a lot baggier clothes and made him never take his clothes off, because he was actually the most in shape out of all of them. People said that with his shirt off, he looked like a ripped Jesus. So they had to put him in over baggy clothes and over to make sure that he didn't overshadow Chris Hemsworth as that character in the movie.
Yeah, and then he couldn't jump in and take that swim with the rest of the characters. He kind of had to stand up on shore fully clothed.
Yeah, because it would have ruined the joke of him being like the scrawny, just like goofy stoner character
Yeah.
if he did that.
And I also thought it was funny that Fran Kranz had to go through behavior and prop training to be a stoner. He had a 2-hour joint rolling session and also a bong lighting session with expert consultants.
You find that funny? If I were casted, I wouldn't need to do any research. I'm like,
I know, right?
I was like, you had to do research for that? Oh,
We could have been the expert consultants.
yeah, I could have been your consultant. But yeah, I mean,
But to give you an idea of how impressive the release of the monsters was in this movie, I went through and got the choices off the monster board. You know, when they're on there and they're making bets of which monsters will attack these teenagers. The monster board had choices like werewolf, alien beast, mutants, wraiths, zombies, reptiles, clowns, witches, sexy witches, demons, hell lord, angry molesting tree, one of my favorites, giant snake, deadite from Evil Dead, mummy, the bride, the scarecrow folk, snowman, dragon bat, vampires, dismemberment goblins, some more of my favorites, sugar plum fairy, merman, the reanimated, unicorn, huron, sasquatch, wendigo, yeti, dolls, zombie redneck torture family, the doctors, jack-o'-lantern, giant, twins, and Kevin. Kevin was like a Best Buy employee that also dismembered people. That was the description of Kevin.
interesting.
So that was my pick for the 2010s, The Great Cabin in the Woods.
It's a good choice.
Meta horror at its finest.
So, horror being what it was, as I explained, I feel like the big explosion kind of happened around 2013, 14 with like the Babadook. And It Follows, and then the rest of the decade you saw a nonstop stream of like this type of art house horror film. There was one, and we've talked about it before, but I think this really deserves to be highlighted, and this is one of the reasons I didn't pick The Devil's Rejects. I want to highlight The Lords of Salem from 2012 by Rob Zombie, and I actually watched it again recently. I watched that movie several times throughout the years, and it's had a weird effect on me. I did not like it the first time I saw it. I thought it was a very well-directed film. I thought the script was lacking in a lot of places, and I felt that the ending was very unsatisfying. And I remember being kind of disappointed because I had certain type of expectations for what a Rob Zombie film is. I saw it again years later, and I liked it quite a bit more. Some of my criticisms sort of melted away from it. And I saw it once more about a year later, and then I ended up appreciating the ending, and I started to find it kind of quietly haunting, that I was starting to understand what it was that Rob Zombie was going for. I saw it for a fourth time, and I showed it to a friend about a year ago, and like my friend was blown away by it, and we were kind of like, I really started to love the ending, and it started to take on this very tragic quality to it the more I'd seen it. And then I saw it again recently, and it only confirmed it to me that this is actually good. It took me a lot of time to like really absorb and appreciate what he was doing with this movie, and I think that had it came out a few years later, it might have found more of an audience because it just missed the art house horror craze. And also, I don't think people were expecting Rob Zombie to make this type of horror film. It's not what you think of when you think of his bread and butter. You think of him more in terms of exploitation horror and a lot of nasty horror and things like that. And this is a movie that I think is really atmospheric. I think it's beautifully directed. I think the style of it reminds me a little bit of a throwback to Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci, and sort of that style of like atmospheric, very creepy horror. I think that Sherry Moon Zombie is actually very good in this movie because there's a regularness to her. She feels like a certain type of person, like a cool, hip, older, like a mother type of character, like a mom, like a cool, hip mom that might be hanging on a little bit to her like 90s past and her edginess from her past, but there's still a little bit of the coolness to her there. And I loved one of the things that this movie does is that one of Rob Zombie's directorial staples, and he does this in most of his movies, is he does this thing where you'll be in the middle of something that's really horrifying. Let's say, like in The Devil's Rejects, you are seeing certain characters who are victims of the family being sadistically terrorized and psychologically broken down and toyed with. And then it flashes it with pictures from happier times when they're smiling and they look all happy. And it keeps doing, he does this a lot in this movies where people are going through like intense, psychologically damaging or violent situations that you know are going to completely change who they are as a person if they even make it out alive. And it's usually done for like a darkly comedic effect. Rob Zombie does the same thing here that he does in those movies, but he does it because this story is so much different. It actually takes on a different element towards the end of the story. When you see Sherry Moon Zombie falling into this pit of despair as she's being sucked in to a coven of witches who are kind of targeting her because of the platform she has as a radio DJ to play their record and kind of send out these rain signals that by the end of the movie you feel really bad for her. And when you see the pictures of her in happier times, instead of having the funny feel that all of Rob Zombie's do, I always get like a kick out of it. There's like something darkly funny. Here it actually feels very tragic and it feels very sad. And I think this also helps kind of hinted at that the Sherry Moon Zombie's character as a DJ has a past history with addiction and drug abuse problems. And as she's getting sucked more into and by this coven of witches, the way that she's carrying about herself is very reminiscent of a drug addict who's in free fall and kind of losing their soul to something else. So it's almost works as kind of a metaphor for a certain type of drug addiction and how you think back on people who you know were really happy in real life but ended up in a miserable place. I also think it's creepy. This has some of the best imagery in any Rob Zombie movie. I think that the three witches in here are extremely creepy. They get under my skin. Has some really fantastic sequences. It's such a beautiful movie to look at. It's extremely artistic. And even though to me, this is like an art film, an art house horror movie, it still retains enough of Rob Zombie's sort of grimy, gritty aesthetic married to something a little bit more atmospheric and beautiful. You still doesn't lose the essence of Rob Zombie and what his style of filmmaking is. So you still get a sense of a little bit more, I'd say for an art house horror movie, it has a little bit more grit and a little bit like a little bit more exploitation filled than most art house horror does. And I think it came out at the wrong time that it didn't find its audience. And Rob Zombie's follow-up film to this, I believe, was 31. I despise that movie. That is absolute garbage. I hate 31. There are a few horror films that I think that are as unbearable as that movie. And part of me felt like that was Rob Zombie after all the complaints of people complaining that they wanted more of The Devil's Rejects, more of The House of a Thousand Corpses, that after they rejected him, trying to expand his potential as a filmmaker, expand what he could do and kind of expand the style of horror films that he can make and to push his filmmaking to a new direction. So typical of fanboys to completely reject it and demand that he gives them more of the same. And what resulted was 31, which to me is like everything about Rob Zombie done awful and pumped up to absolute like 11, that it borders on a parody of a Rob Zombie movie. It almost seems like he was desperately trying to, and I could be wrong. I do not claim to have a grasp on the motivations of every artist, so I cannot say that Rob Zombie did this. But the impression that I get off of it, at least from my point of view, is that movie seems like a director who lost some of his audience and is desperate to shock them and to bring them back into the fold, to reassure them it's okay, I'm still here, I'm still depraved, and I can still do this type of horror movie. And it just seemed desperate and weak, and it's just like I would have rather seen Rob Zombie spread out and try different types of horror films than going back and jumping back into the well and producing something that to me borders on a parody. Luckily, I'm okay at it because 3 from Hell ended up being pretty fantastic. I loved 3 from Hell. It was able to kind of like go back to that style but still bring something fresh and creative and cool and entertaining and engaging to it, where 31 didn't work. So I think this is the misunderstood film in Rob Zombie's filmography. And in all fairness, I feel like it takes at least for me, it took a handful of viewings to actually understand what he was going for in this movie, to understand what makes it so good. So I think this is probably an unsung art house horror that never gained its audience in a decade that was defined by art house horror movies that built cult audiences.
Yeah, that's one I still only watched once. I need to go back and revisit it, especially after you're making me appreciate it more. Because I always liked it. I thought it was really good, really atmospheric, and then it just got to that ending, and I just didn't feel the ending. So I want to watch it again after hearing you talk about it.
Yeah, I think it has sort of a tragic dimension to it, especially when you kind of tie it to drug addiction and the struggles that people go through and the way that people lose people who are vibrant and sweet and fun to be around kind of lose their soul to this kind of drug. And I think a lot of people can relate to that or have seen loved ones go through that process in their life. That seems to be using horror, which horror does, because horror is just a way to explore our innermost fears, the way that we can use greater horror things, more fantastical things to explore things that are a little bit closer to home. Like David Cronenberg does it all the time with body horror. That's just a metaphor for disease and cancer and the paranoia that people feel about their insides. So horror is the perfect way to explore these inner traumas and fears in a way that makes it fun, puts it into context, and adds a little bit of imagination and fantasy to it.
Yeah. That was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
Another divisive movie.
Yeah, another divisive one, but one that I've actually come to love over the years. Like I've really, really liked Lords of Salem quite a bit.
Definitely prompted me to watch it again.
Yes. So that's my pick for the 2010s. Really, I wanted to pick The Witch originally, but I have talked that movie to death, and everybody already knows that. So yeah. Lords of Salem, great movie.
So we're kind of forced to brush over these decades because we're kind of trying to cover 100 years of horror.
Yeah.
But we'll probably go back and dive into these decades like we did with the 90s one. And we did 90s and the 2000s, right?
2000s and 2010s.
Yeah.
Basically the last 3 decades.
Yeah, so we'll be doing a deeper dive into some of these decades, but we wanted to kind of clean our palate before we get into the 2021 movies and go past our 100th episode and take a look back on 100 years of horror and how it's flourished and evolved.
This is going to be a busy year for horror films too. It's going to be a really busy year because there was a lot of horror movies that were on the slate for 2020. Saint Maud being another one of the big ones. Quiet Place 2, one of the more commercial ones that were going to be the horror movies of 2020 about pushed back. So whatever was already going to come out in 2021 with all the unreleased 2020 stuff, I imagine this is going to be a very busy year, not just for the horror genre, but movies in general. So we're probably going to get, I hope at least this means that it's going to be an overwhelmingly good year.
Which blows me away because look at all the notable releases in 2020. I'm still going through them and I'm still shocked and amazed at what I'm finding. Mm-hmm. For a year where a lot of the major horror releases were pushed forward to 2021, how did we still get so many notable horror releases in 2020? It's wow. Mm-hmm. I'm really going to enjoy this stuff.
But there's a lot of 2020 horror movies we haven't discussed on the podcast, but I'm not going to lie. A lot of them that I feel are good are not working for me the same way. Like a good example of them is like, what is that movie, His House?
Yeah.
That's supposedly one of the best horror movies of 2020. And I like it and it's really good, but there's something about it that just doesn't cross over into that greatness. There is a handful I've seen, but it might just be a personal thing or it may be in my mood, but a lot of the stuff is not satisfying me the way I would, where I recognize the quality. I don't know if I'm getting cynical or what it is with me right now or at the moment.
Well, for me, I'm getting really excited because I keep finding new releases from 2020 that feel very personal to me and mm-hmm. speak to me personally, and they feel like they're mine. You know what I mean? Like, oh, nobody else is going to appreciate this like I do. I love this.
Mm-hmm. So that's our podcast. That ends our 2-part special on 100 years of horror. So Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show. That's where you can keep up with us there. On Instagram, it's Instagram. What is it on Instagram? At Pickles Horror Show.
Yeah, at Pickles Horror Show, yeah.
And we're available on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and if you're interested in finding where all of our stuff is available, just look at our description, and there is a link to our Flow page that gives you access to every platform that we are on.
Yep, and you're going to see a lot of stuff coming from us, not just the podcast. We're going to be doing interviews and reviewing a bunch of movies, but we're also going to be coming up with some horror films coming up. We're working on 2 or 3 features at the moment. We're going to be doing a music video coming up in the next few months. So there's a lot of stuff coming up on the horizon that you need to keep checking back.
Yep. So follow.
We'll be talking about it here on the podcast too.
All right. Till next week, folks. Happy horror.
Happy horror.